A common way to approach most dungeon duties in Final Fantasy XIV is to simply pull as much as you can and then AoE it all down fast. In your average party, this is pretty simple standard stuff. But among all the duties, there are definitely some where you may give a bit of a worried glance at your party as the big pull begins if you're not 100% confident in them. Simply put, some wall-to-wall pulls are much harder than others, or at least requires everyone to bring it just a bit more. Some of you told me in the comments of the last video on this topic that I missed a bunch of hard pulls, especially from optional dungeons. So let's go over some more of the craziest and hardest AoE pulls in Final Fantasy XIV. This time, I will try to organize the pulls in order from least difficult to most difficult. But keep in mind, this is just my opinion. Remember, if you feel like I missed one this time, it is possible I already covered it in the previous video, which would be why you will not see duties like Stone Vigil, Mount Gulg, or Bottom's Medal in this one. And finally, do be sure to let me know what AoE pulls you find the hardest, or most entertaining if the answer is none, in the comments. But with that, let's get to it. Number 10. The whole cellar in Haukke Manor. This pull is one of the bigger ones in A Realm Reborn, all things considered, and can easily make it seem a lot harder than it really is. This is further amplified by the simple fact that you're level 31 at most here, so the tanks have limited defensive options and healers have limited healing options. Unless you're an astrologian, essential dignity, and cards? Amazing. The sheer quantity of mobs you can pull can lead to the tank dying quite abruptly. However, a key detail that tends to make A Realm Reborn gigapulls oddly easier than expected at times is the fact that often the mobs in the AoE pulls are either as fast as you or slower. Furthermore, while you have to traverse the cellar of Haukke Manor in a particular direction due to a little ramp, nothing prevents you from running laps in the cellar. Assuming the tank can hold aggro on everything while doing so, they can genuinely take next to no damage while pulling everything in the cellar. In fact, they could pull packs on the way down to the cellar as well, as none of the mobs in the dungeon are outright ranged. And, as such, you can simply run away until the mobs die from shield lobs or tomahawks, or until the party mobs up the place. This makes this AoE pull hilariously big, while simultaneously, a bit similarly to Tastasha, surprisingly easy to do. Number 9. Both of the AoE pulls at the start of Dohn Mheg. What makes these pulls worth mentioning at all are the frogs. If the frog is allowed to buff up a mob, it instantly makes the pull significantly harder, but still very manageable. But of course, all you need to do is interrupt the frog, and the tank has an interrupt, so there you go. I would also mention the rather large middle pull after the second boss, as it has a few mobs with surprise tank busters. The pull is only about 2 packs and a bit, but simply hits harder than a normal pull. It's just tough enough that some groups will prefer to split it up in smaller parts. If you are the tank or healer in the group, my tip for this one is to be willing to use everything you have here, as the pull that follows is just a single pack that you probably won't need any bigger defensives for if it really comes to that. The single pack that precedes this one also doesn't really require any major cooldowns, giving even more opportunity to use everything here. Number 8. The large pull just before the second boss of the drowned city of Skalla. What can make this pull challenging is mainly down to the Phobad rock monsters, as they use a line AoE with no telegraph, which can easily lead some players to get hit. Aside from that, the challenge simply boils down to there's like 10 mobs, which means the sustained damage of all those mobs can be a bit overwhelming if the pull drags on for long. The pull before this one is not that big, and the boss that follows after will not require much in terms of big defensives either, so what it really comes down to is using all of your cooldowns efficiently and smartly here as a tank. Number 7. Pharos Sirius, the pull at the start of the dungeon, as well as the long pull after the first boss. The pull right at the start has a tendency to sneak up on a lot of players, partly because the relatively low mob count hits surprisingly hard. At the same time, some of the mobs take a bit to actually spawn, which means the optimal way to clear the whole pool as fast as possible involves stalling damage while waiting for those zombies to finally stand up, while the tank is taking a surprising amount of damage. This pull is actually a bit different than the previously mentioned ones, as if you actually use everything here, it could cause some problems. While there is a single pack after this pull before a boss, the boss itself tends to turn into a huge cluster mess, and if the tank has already spent everything on a pull shortly prior, they may be lacking options if this should happen. In extension of this boss fight can end up distributing quite a lot of vuln stacks, and they don't disappear when the fight is over, so sometimes groups will start the next pull with, say, 5 vuln stacks on the tank, making the start of the pull quite brutal. Speaking of which, that is also where the long pull starts. The pull turns a bunch of corners and is extremely long considering how few packs there are in it. What can really make this pull suddenly go sideways is the fact that the corrupted sprites do a surprising amount of ranged magic damage and will sometimes cast a superior banish spell that does party-wide damage if not interrupted or stunned. Some groups simply don't notice this because the first corrupted sprite tends to cast this as you're pulling, meaning you only get hit by it if you slow down or fall behind. And by the time you reach the destination, there's enough mobs that the sprite could easily sneak in their cast if you don't pay close attention. In a way, Pharos Sirius, in general, is just a dungeon filled with mobs that hit hard but are quite fragile. Number 6. The final pull of the Tower of Babil. In a similar way to other leveling dungeons where a pair of pulls hurt, the pull preceding this one directly limits the amount of cooldowns you may have for the 2 hypertuned specimens, and, the rest of the mobs there. The good news is that what follows after is the final boss, so if the tank invuln is available, this is the perfect time. If you have a ranged physical or mage DPS, a limit break is also well spent right here. Indeed, what really makes this pull hard is simply a big bunch of mobs that hit pretty hard, but unlike, say, Tower of Zod, it is relatively clear which mobs are doing that damage. Number 5. The first AoE pull in Akadaemia Anyder. An optional dungeon from Shadowbringers that does not really unlock anything, makes it easily missed by most. Each section of the dungeon has oddities within their packs. In the second portion there are mobs with unusually slow movement, which incentivizes the party to hold their damage until they make it to the blob. The third section has mobs that cast raid-wide AoEs, among other things. But the first section, in addition to having some line AoEs, also is simply a really big pull of about 3 or 4 packs or so in power, with a bunch of different telegraphs. What probably really makes this pull most challenging is how rare the duty is itself, meaning a lot of players are not sure what to expect. Number 4. The huge pull after the first boss in Shisui of the Violet Tides. What gets a lot of groups on this one is that the first pack engages you rather than you engaging it, which makes it pretty common that the tank might miss the timing on activating Sprint, losing out on 10 seconds of it, making the pull take longer as a result. The pull totals 12 mobs, and most of them can get a lot of free hits in, including Gust/Surprise mini-tank busters, while you are pulling. This is slightly further compounded by the fact the last pack has 2 archers, so if the tank were to attempt to kite the mobs a bit, which does help a bit, the archers will continue to do full damage. However, the big positive of this pull is that it is surrounded by bosses, so your tank and healer probably has most of their cooldowns for this and will not need to hold them for anything. Number 3. Sunken Temple of Qarn, the portion before the first boss. The biggest possible pull that can be performed here involves, well, first skipping the bats at the start, and then picking up the mobs in the first room, running through the corridor, and then there's the pack in the next corridor. You can pull the boss at this point too if you like. However, what makes this pull scary in the first place is that it does not just have 1 bee, not just 2 bees, no, it has 3 bees. And unless your team is really bringing it on the damage, it may be necessary to single target the bees one at a time at some point, to prevent them from suddenly final stinging the tank. While Final Sting is a survivable attack, it does so much damage that with this many mobs, the tank is likely to die before you can heal them. If you are going to do this full pull with the boss included, I would actually recommend Paladin as your tank, and of course Astrologian as your healer. A greater concentration of melee DPS, meaning more stuns, can also help. The reason for this is that Astrologian, again, has essential dignity and their cards as well as light speed, while the other healers don't yet quite have their OGCD options. Paladin, of course, has the advantage that they can block some hits, but more importantly, the reason I recommend Paladin specifically is that if it comes to it, Shield Bash should prevent bees from finishing their final sting casts. I am indeed suggesting that if you are pulling all of this, that you might be able to get away with AoEing everything for a bit longer by simply having the tank stun the bees one by one when they try to final sting. Low blow combined with any melee's leg sweeps can further add to this. Although, speaking of melee DPS, Dragoon, Ninja, and to some degree even Monk are not recommended as much, as Samurai, Reaper, and Viper have more AoE options at this level, better for an extended battle. On top of this, Dancer's standard finish can dish out a good amount of AoE damage while also hitting one enemy, a bee hopefully, extra hard, allowing the team to continue AoEing without neglecting the bees. Because of how much attention these bees require, I would say that there is really no benefit to pulling everything alongside the boss, so counting the boss in the big pull makes little sense. I also believe that this big pull, even without the boss, may not be the wisest move in a random group, but, you know, gauge your teams. Number 2. The supremely long pull after the second boss in Amdapor Keep. This pull has several twists and turns, involves around 4 packs or so, as well as somewhere around up to 4 or 6 singular patrolling mobs, and most of the mobs each have at least one telegraph or otherwise cast you need to be aware of. Some of the mobs shoot out circle AoE fireballs, some of them perform frontal cleaves, some have gaze mechanics to worry about stepping out of or looking away from, so whatever happens, you really need to pay attention. What often wipes groups here is that as it is in a Realm Reborn dungeon, most of the mobs can be outrun by just continuing to run, just like in Haukke Manor. This causes an effect where the tank might continue pulling and pulling, taking next to no damage, and then promptly splatting on the floor when all the mobs slam into them at the same time at the end. This would be the kind of pull where a tank would be incentivized to use cooldowns in anticipation of being attacked. Another way the tank can play around this pull is that if too many mobs are still somehow alive as they reach their destination, is to simply keep running somewhere. One option is to try and make a U-turn at the end of the road and just circle back around to run back. Another way, if there are just way too many mobs, is to slam some defensive cooldowns and just rush through the mobs. The key benefit of a pull with an extremely long hallway is that, if need be, you can always just run the same way back for more path. Obviously, this trick costs a lot of damage output for both the tank and the rest of the party, so it is definitely not recommended if it is not needed. However, it is worth mentioning, as I have heard a lot of groups having trouble with this pull, especially because they might have a party that either cannot or will not attack the pack while it is being pulled. If, for example, your healer just is not attacking, or your DPS are mainly comprised of mages, this may likely happen. Which of course again means that optimally this pull is performed with a not white mage, as all the other healers can AoE freely while following along in some way or another, and preferably combine that with melee's or ranged physical DPS. Gunbreaker's Aurora or Paladin's ability to block combined with Prominence's absolutely stupefying potency makes them both excellent tanks for this pull too. Number 1. The Giga pull before the second boss in Neverreap. As an entirely optional dungeon, just like Akadaemia Anyder, a lot of players may have never experienced Neverreap or even know what it is. Now, if you were to just enter the dungeon and look at the possibilities, what would first stand out as a challenging pull would probably be the pull before the first boss, with these tornadoes getting in the way, as well as a reasonably large amount of mobs to pull. However, while this pull can be challenging, and if the tornadoes hit your healer, things could certainly go sideways, the real challenging pull of the dungeon is the Giga pull before the second boss. This pull can include 2 pairs of bees, and yes, they do in fact use Final Sting, and yes, if they do, your tank will probably die if they don't invuln it. Granted, these bees patrol around and can actually be skipped if you move carefully. However, it is quite unlikely both of them get dodged naturally, especially since very few players have much experience with this dungeon, so they might not even know that the bees are optional. Obviously, the optimal setup for a pull like this is with a warrior raw intuition. White Mage has a bit of an AoE on the move disadvantage, but might be really strong at the destination with their stuns, so any healer's probably fine if you play to their strengths. And the DPS could be anything that can keep up the attack on the move. I'd say, in addition to melees and ranged physicals, Summoner could probably keep up here very easily with Dreadgram Trance too, although, honestly, mages are probably fine at this point. So, which pulls do you think are the hardest or most entertaining to pull off? Among the pulls I listed here, are there any that you had never considered but might just try now? Maybe some pulls you now learned exist and fear meeting in random groups? Do be sure to let me know in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, originally, Warrior's Raw Intuition worked completely differently. Its effect used to be that all attacks from in front of you would be parried, but attacks from any other direction would be critical hits. Combined with a roll action that made you immune to critical hits, everything would be parried. In a strange way, Raw Intuition still interacted with healing you, as supposedly it also caused healing from behind you or your sides to critically hit you as well.